Well, here we are. The final wrenching episode of the K100 build. Certainly not the final piece of content for the build, but 14 is the last episode that you'll see me working on things because after this, the bike will be pretty much finished. Although, is a project bike ever really finished? This build period had a few new sponsors on Patreon, and as always, I'm forever grateful for the generosity. Many thanks to Pablo Rosario, Andy NG, and Wayne DeVaris. I do appreciate you guys jumping on board even though the build was pretty much closing out at that point. I also sold most of the parts that I posted for sale, and I made about $800 before shipping, which bumped that down to close to $600. I legitimately threw about 8 parts away because I wasn't joking when I said that I would do that. One of which was the yellow wheel, which really confused me considering how many people were claiming it once they knew I didn't need it anymore, but nobody followed through. So at the end of the previous episode, there were only a few things left to do, a few stragglers to clean up. But there was also a couple things that I didn't write down, and for misleading you guys, Ginger decided to take a huge piss on my bike and then sit there all smug-like. First thing to do was to settle on a muffler for the exhaust. Second was to find a coolant overflow tank. I also bought a second battery, which kinda ended up being a waste because I revived the first one, but I guess it doesn't hurt to have a spare, right? Anyway, I'll explain that one later. I really started off by playing around with that dual exhaust pipe idea that I had mentioned before on Instagram. I had done so by ordering a mid-Y pipe for a Yamaha FZ6. I was actually dragging my feet on this one because I could only find a pipe on eBay with a package deal with 2 mufflers for about $150 or so, which is a lot of money for ultimately something that might not work, you know? Plus it would be shipping from China, which would take 8 years to get here. But I searched on Amazon and I found the mid pipe alone for a measly $30-something. And it was on Prime shipping, so it only took a day to get to me. You know, the comments in the last episode addressing the muffler honestly had me facepalming, because I had already mentioned in several places that I was going to replace the megaphone muffler with something shorter because it's literally less than an inch over the tire and it would be immediately destroyed on the road when I hit the first pothole. I mean, I feel like you could probably assume that I'm half smart enough to not run a pipe that's practically touching a wheel. Anyway, I used a miter saw to cut the pipe to a mockable length. You know, I just wanted to see if the angle and the diameters were right, so in practice, this Y pipe would be cut even shorter. The diameter for the collector and the Y pipe were the exact same, so I had to sort of zip tie it, you know, over the outlet just to kind of get it to stay there by itself. And this meant that the angle was unrealistically high, but it was how I would want it to look. So really, I came to the conclusion that getting dual undertails was a lot more work than I thought it would be. And I even looked around for reducers or something to help mock it up more accurately, but I ain't have any luck with that. I understood the work and the money needed to do it, and I'm too fine with just having one muffler to really pursue it. I'll just get a shorter muffler like I said I would. I mentioned that I bought a second battery. Well, that was because after putting the bike away last episode when I was running the engine, I believed that I put the bike away with the ignition on. So basically I hit the kill switch, but not the key switch. And at the time, the bike had no lights or anything hooked up, so it was easy to forget that. I plugged the battery into a charger, and it wouldn't accept any charge for some reason. So that's why in this video, I'm demonstrating the motoscope on the FZ1. So with my second battery on the way, I started getting kind of bored. The problem is, my day off was freakishly cold, you know, something like 19 degrees that morning. The day before it rained and it soaked the rag that I left on top of the doghouse, so it froze. This is the cold that I'm dealing with. So I very quickly scratched the idea of wrenching in this cold, even though I was fully clothed, but instead of just going inside and drinking some tea, I grabbed my gringo helmet and I tried to see how I looked on the bike and, you know, how the ergonomics felt. Now the main thing that I wanted to avoid is for my feet to be aimed straight down at the ground and for my arms to be parallel with the road with no bend in them, you know, like Superman. Which is what I find happens on some cafe races and a lot of time K-bikes with the stock subframes. With the new subframe, I'm sitting rather high, which allows my long legs to not look cramped, and it gives like a more sport bike like downward angle for my arms. The height and position of the pegs also means that it doesn't look like I'm sitting on my balls. And ultimately I can raise up or pull back those clip-ons if I want to. But I'm still sitting on a piece of cardboard, and I need to change that before someone comments about it for the 8th time. Last episode I had mentioned that I was gonna go ahead and hand over the job to an upholstery shop to take care of it for me. It's not terribly difficult to find an upholstery shop around here, but not all of them make seat pans. So I finally found one. You know, I'll give them all the details. It's gonna cost me an average of $850. That was painful, but you know, they're gonna do a better job than me, and this is the last real expense of the build. So, you know, let's just do this last thing so my money can be mine for the first time in 12 months. So at this point, I'm ready to break down the bike, you know, move it to the street and then drive it over to them. But I was told that there was no room physically for another bike, but in a week or so, there will be. And I offered to bring only the frame and the gas tank since it's a K-bike and, you know, it comes apart like Legos. Still need a week though. All right, no problem. A week goes by, but I don't want to be that guy, you know? 10 days goes by, no update. 2 weeks. By this point, you know, I'm just like, fuck it, because on media, they were posting daily photos of jobs they were finishing, but I couldn't get so much as an update. So I just ended up hitting up another shop, and I submitted a detailed description of the job, but unfortunately the owner was actually on vacation, so I mean, I don't hold that against him, but it did give me, it gave me the confidence to try it myself. So they got back to me after, you know, I decided that I was just gonna do it myself. See, I already knew that I wanted to keep the general shape of the cardboard seat that's already on the bike, but I couldn't use it as a template because it was rather sloppily made. So I just made a new one by putting slits in the cardboard to outline the subframe arms. Since the arms are straight, I just took a straight edge and continued along the slits all the way down through the cardboard. For the skateboard-like kicktails on either end of the seat pan, I just eyeballed it and cut out the shapes of half circles on either end. And the template was made. I traced the shape out onto a sheet of 0.063 inch thick 6061 grade aluminum. The 12 by 24 inch shape was perfect. So I just went ahead and cut the sheet with some shears. I cut roughly around the lines that I made just to practice before I got to the cuts that actually mattered. I lubed up the blades, and then I went at it. And now, to bend it. See, this is what you call a bending brake. Use it to bend metal sheets up to 16 gauge thickness, which is great because that's about what this sheet is. What isn't great is that it's 6061 grade aluminum, which is notoriously difficult to bend because it'll just snap in two with enough pressure. So in order to bend it, you have to heat it up. Now, I'm not sure if this process of heating is high or long enough to be considered annealing, but it definitely works. I'm using a MAP gas torch along the bend lines that I drew on the sheet and just lining it up with the brake. Now, this is a shitty cheap one, so you have to use C-clamps for force. The brake is also screwed down to the table so it doesn't move naturally. Now, at this point, I seriously don't want this thing to snap on me because, you know, I'm decent amount of work into this seat pan, so I just kept heating and bending it little by little, you know, just to be safe. Mocking it up, going back, and then bending it some more. Eventually, I was done bending the sheet, and I was very much satisfied with how it looked. I ended up having to trim the vertical bend where it meets the tank, so it would stop like digging into my thighs. Last episode, I attempted to mount the taillight by drilling out these hardened stainless steel brackets, but the seat pan now was aluminum, which would be child's play to incorporate taillight brackets into it. Oh, and speaking of child's play, these are child window guard brackets. So all I had to do was drill out some mounting holes, and boom. Oh, by the way, that's the new muffler that I got for cheap. It's shorter and therefore it clears the tire, but it's still aimed roughly at the tire, which is less than ideal. But for now, I'm just gonna run it and I'll replace it somewhere down the line. Now, over anything, I was glad to see that the plate clears the exhaust though. If later in this video you see me running the megaphone that was on there previously, you know, for tests, it's because it's quieter, and I'm sure my neighbors appreciate that. So there's no reason to run a louder one if I'm just doing tests. I used some nuts and bolts that I had to mount it up, but I'll be using button head bolts all around so they don't protrude through the foam too much. I went with an integrated taillight, signals, and plate light assembly just to keep things clean back there, you know, and simple. By this point, I had the idea of simply using a track bike seat pad. So here's the Instagram story that I made regarding that. So yeah, the next step was to mount the injection brain and make mounts for the seat onto the subframe. I simply drilled the 3 appropriate holes for mounting the brain, and then using more child safety brackets, I made the seat pan mounts onto the frame. But the panel gap between the tank and the seat pan was honestly bugging me. Basically, the rear of the tank has a point in the middle that sticks out slightly proud of either side. So using a rubber mallet, I just flattened it out as best as I could. I can't safely get rid of the curve that the tank makes where the old seat contacts it, but at least it closes the gap at the bottom. It only has rear mounts, so it kind of vibrates at the front, which means I'll just have to put foam between where the seat pan touches the tank so it'll stop rattling. I took some time to scuff and paint the front fender because I was putting that off for a while. But the next real job was to finalize the electrics. But to be honest, I got really fast with that part because I felt like it wasn't necessary to film everything to do with plugging in all the wires and stuff. So instead, I'm just gonna give a live summary in another video as to how the wiring of the bike was finished. So the bike ran and it started with 0 issues whatsoever, but it was time to dial in the throttle bodies. So this is the CarbTune Pro, pretty much one of the best synchronization tools out there because you get 4 ports for 4 cylinders and it comes with everything you need besides a T-junction for the vacuum line on throttle body number 4. Now you can opt to use a T-junction for the last throttle body since the fuel pressure regulator uses the vacuum port on that one. That's the hose right there with the spring around it. You should run tests with and without the T-junction. The first step is to cut 4 inches off of the end of all 4 black hoses. Then you take that 8 centimeter long thick wall clear hose and you chop it into 4 separate 2 centimeter long hoses like so. These essentially shrink the inner diameter for a brief second along the hose, acting as a vacuum restrictor. This helps the readings go smoother on the CarbTune itself. On one end of the long hose, you insert the clear tube. Then you add the shorter hose that you cut from earlier, and it should look something like this. Attach all 3 hoses to each port on the throttle bodies, but for the 4th one, with the vacuum line to the pressure regulator that I mentioned earlier, I took the 4-inch section of black hose and I cut that in half, placing the T between the 2 halves. You can either hang the CarbTune right side up or upside down, and all it does is really pretty much change where the 0 point on the scale is, and in some cases smooth out the readings. There are rods in the CarbTune that'll move in accordance to the level of vacuum in each throttle body. The point is to level out each one evenly by turning the brass screws. They say starting at 1.5 turns from fully seated is a good place to start when you start to sync them. This is my first time trying to do this, so I don't have much in the way of advice and I'm not going to act like I'm a pro at it. It's not as hard as you think, but I did run into trouble in my case. Now, as you can see, I pretty much got them to sync up on the tool, but I ran into the issue of the throttle not fully closing for whatever reason. Now, I could press down on the throttle ever so slightly and drop the idle, but it goes back up when I let it go. Now, this prompted me to touch the forbidden linkage screws, which kind of threw everything out of whack. And I explained what happened in a recent vlog that I put out in great detail. And if you didn't watch that, then, go ahead if you want to. In any case, as you can see, the bike ran and everything, but there were a few things that I just couldn't fix, and it was too many for me to overlook and move on from. Even though the sync was there, I still had issues of high idle, stuttering revs, especially like when the revs got high, there was a dead point where the mixture would just be off and then it would come back. It's hard to explain. When you disturb the linkage screws, the official solution is to literally replace the entire throttle assembly. Just outright replace it. So my idea was to buy a set from eBay and just step back for a while, as I explained in that motovlog that I just mentioned. The seller not only used the slowest shipping service level that I've ever experienced, but the packaging was also a bit, Sketchy. Anyway, nothing strange with these, just a bit dirty, but I could clean that off. They make a healthy snap when I close them, but most importantly, do you see this blue paint on this nut and screw? Yeah, those are the butterfly screws that you're not meant to touch unless you really know what you're doing, which I do not. The third and final screw didn't have the paint on it, which scared me a little bit, but I'll just have to trust that nobody so much as looked at it too hard. You know, I never understand why eBay sellers don't just clean up these items a little bit, for presentation, considering just how easy the dirt comes off if you use the right cleaner. I use throttle body cleaner and compressed air real quick to get off the heavy stuff. Now, these will never look as good as the ones did staying polished up for me, but I could compromise by swapping over anything that didn't require me to disturb the throttle butterflies at all. I also took the opportunity to replace the old intake manifold rubbers with some silicone sealant, which I was going to do when extracting the bike, but I might as well do it now, no point not to. I ran a sync test with the brass screw setting that these came with just to see where it was, as is. Then I replaced the brass screws with the nice ones and synced it up again. I was pretty much happy with what I got, but I realized that this later year K-bike, this is a 1989 set of throttles, and the bike is a 1986. But I realized that this year requires a longer throttle cable, so they redesigned the cam wheel. I mounted up the coolant reservoir, which matched the radiator, and my final verdict on the running state of the bike was this. Startup, no issues, starts as soon as I hit the button. Idle. When the bike is cold, it starts with no problem and idles at around 1,000 RPM. Once the bike warms up, it'll idle at about 1,300 RPM. Now, I heard that some people prefer to idle this high as it improves the response off the line, so it's not that much out of the ordinary. The adjuster screw can still be pushed down to drop the idle even on the second throttle set. The TPS, the throttle and choke cable were removed, and I made sure that the clamps weren't interfering with the assembly moving. This tells me that maybe that was never actually an issue. So I just rested the idle screw on the post wherever it decided to stop, and then I messed with that air bypass screw. And I could drop the idle with those, but then it would make the bike stumble more with the lower RPM. I may mess with the mixture screw at the mass airflow sensor, but honestly, I'll take a 200 RPM higher idle over any other issues. Throttle response. The one thing to get used to is that these motors are not the crack-headed Japanese racing fours that'll blip in a millisecond from fully closed to snap fully open throttle with no problem. These are inertia-heavy motors. Everything about them is a little bit more slower. So snapping the throttle open really quick under no load confuses it for a second, for a very tiny moment before it eventually catches up and climbs. The speed of the blips that you see in the video is about how snappy I could get it to open up without it getting pissed off. Not too bad, but different from what I'm used to. High RPM is where not touching the linkage screws on the second throttle body set really helped, because before, like I said, there was notable dead zone as the revs climbed up before the power came back in. Some of these revs in this video actually went pretty damn high, as you heard, and they sound pretty good. It sustains the RPM too. So I'll replace the temp sensor to see if that helps the temp sensitive idle when I move the bike out. Remember I made that list of things to do when I reassemble the bike on the street? Well, I'm adding the make a throttle cable, put the neoprene seat pad, and to replace the temperature sensor to it. But as far as wrenching in the backyard goes, I am done. Dunzo. That's a wrap. So where does this leave me? Well, I have a bike stuck in the backyard that I can't ride, so I gotta pick a day to bring it out. And when will I do that? When I decide on a place to put it. I mean, it's gonna suck adding a build to my life since there's no such thing as free storage. So no more wrenching, but in terms of content, this is far from over. So here's what I plan soon, like in the near future. I want to give an overview or a summary of the electrical system since I kind of glossed over that, for the lighting towards the end of this. It's actually way cooler than I thought. On top of that, I have 3 concrete videos planned that touch on some of the more logistical sides of building a bike, but don't be surprised if even more topics come to my mind. Economics, psychology, advice, and that's not even counting when I extract the bike and I ride the bike and all that. I seriously have a lot to say about this year-long experience of mine, and I have a lot of people to thank as well. So I just want to stress that this is not the end, and I can't wait to vent and show some appreciation. At this point, I'm just tired and I need a nap, so I'll end this episode here. You just watched episode 14 of my K100 build series. Time to get this thing out of here. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next one.